Welcome to Good God, conversations that matter about faith and public life. I'm your host, George Mason, and I'm delighted to have a special conversation today with State Representative Carl Sherman, Sr. From DeSoto, who is a remarkable public servant, a personal friend as well, and a real agent for reconciliation and justice in our community. Carl, welcome to Good God.
Thank you, Pastor Mason. George, I really love you as a person, as a human being. You are God sent, and just grateful for your thoughtful leadership, and not just in the church, but beyond the walls of the church. Just excited every time I see you at various events, whether it be civic or community minded events. You are really an ambassador, I believe, for Christ, and showing the light beyond the church walls. So thank you. And thank you for having me.
Sure. Well, coming from you, that means a lot to me. And let's just start there, though, because you called me pastor, and I can do the same to you. I introduced you as a state representative, but, you know, this program is called Good God. And I like to connect the dots there. That is to say, here you are a pastor yourself of a Church of Christ in DeSoto, and you are also serving as a politician, a political figure. So in a sense, what we're talking about here is that your faith has connected you to public life in a way that combines the God and the good. And so I'm interested in your sense of calling. I think we can all, as ministers, and many people who are watching or listening, understand the language of a call to ministry. But when you think of that call being connected to public service, how do you connect those two things in your own experience?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that a lot of people wrestle with that. And first, I'd like to just begin with the premise that I believe when we walk by faith, we're always walking according to the calling on our lives. God has a purpose for each and every one of us. And I pray that he delights in my ways. Knowing that your steps, your cadence, should be ordered by the Lord. It takes great meditation, I believe, sense of understanding that even though you may be in the pulpit as a pastor, you still, in fact, even more so, I believe, you've got to recalibrate every now and then spiritually. And that means you have to be willing to ask yourself questions. Why am I doing this? Why at this time am I doing this? Is God calling me to do this? And I believe God is not inside of a closet. The God that we serve calls us to go into other territories. Often, if you look at scripturally, we have many examples of men and women who were timid or perhaps reluctant to answer the call. And God had a way of getting their attention from individuals like Moses, who seemed to be an introvert. I can relate. I'm an introvert, and I don't like politics, which, anytime I've campaigned, my wife complains about the fact that I tell people I don't like politics, but I don't. And my press secretary, former press secretary, said it in a meeting one day. She said, "Sir, you don't like politics, but politics likes you." And I think really it's, I don't like politics, but I love people. Mm-hmm. And sometimes when the calling happens, it's uncomfortable. It stretches you to do something you don't want to do. But in the end, if you're the same in public as you are in private, you can do those different missions that God is calling you to do. It's so important to maintain the authenticity of the spiritual walk that He has with you. So I don't run away from the calling that Christ has on my life, even though He's called me to serve in the Texas House of Representatives. I was, my first session, very, very depressed when I came back, because God is popular on the House floor to talk about, but He's not necessarily popular to really be about. And I'm one that believes in I believe in local control, because I serve a God who informs me in His Word that we are all free moral agents. So it's not my duty to push religion on someone. It's my duty, I believe, to be an example. Christ, as He says in Acts 1:1, He came and He came to do and teach. So the doing comes first, the example comes first, and I pray to God that I'm doing it.
You mentioned Moses, and of course the prophets like Jonah and others who had a reluctance about the call that was theirs. But I think sometimes those of us who read the Bible and who approach life from a faith perspective fail to recognize that the call to Moses and to Jonah and to Jeremiah and to others was actually motivated by injustice in the world. That these calls were about bringing about God's righteousness in public life, in the way people operated, and often speaking to powers, whether it's the Pharaoh or even the king of Israel or others, and changing the way people related to one another to make the world a more just and peaceful place. Well, you can't really divide up in the Bible the spiritual then from the political. And so here you are serving in both capacities.
Yeah, George, you summed it up very well. I mean, it is there is this paradox in American politics, I believe, as well as the church, where we compartmentalize our lives and our way of life. And Jesus said, of course, seek ye first the kingdom of God and His righteousness, and all these things shall be added unto you. So there is a certain behavior that should permeate in our lives, no matter where we are in our lives. If we see injustice, we ought to be bold about speaking up against it. And we can't just stand by and watch these things happen. That's why, that's how I first got to know you, was your compassion for the family of Botham Jean and standing up for the injustice that was done, the loss. There are so many people who were quiet on the sidelines, and if we can't rationalize it, we will often blame the victim as opposed to understanding that maybe there's something wrong with our system. And,
all right, let's go there, yeah. Carl, because I think this is an important transition for us in this conversation, because yes, we had a tragedy that occurred when a police officer, Amber Geiger, entered the wrong apartment of Botham Jean, and he thought that she was invading, and she thought he was in her apartment, and she fired her weapon and killed him. Now, we can call that a tragedy on the one hand, but on the other hand, we recognize that there are things that led into that in terms of police training and the use of firearms and unconscious bias that was all at work likely in bringing that to pass. So rather than just mourning as a community, going through the legal process that ended up with the conviction of Amber Geiger, you took it a step further. As a state rep, you proposed, and in a very divided legislature, you got passed the Botham Jean Act. So you moved from street protests to policy in the state capitol to change things on a more permanent basis that would prevent these kinds of things from happening again. Talk to us about that move from the streets to policy and what the Botham Jean Act actually accomplishes.
I want to refer to you invariably as pastor. Going from the pulpit to the pew and protest to policy is one that it's a process in which you have to reconcile the human issues that really affect our day-to-day lives, especially those who do not have a voice. And you have to be able to shepherd that process in which you are measured in your approach, which, really have a lot to do with having your steps ordered by the Lord, I believe. Scripture says in Philippians 4:6, be anxious for nothing, right? In all things, giving prayer and supplication, thanksgiving. So all these things have to be done in a measured way. And it starts with relationships. Every change starts with relationship. Paul talks about having the ministry of reconciliation. And I believe wholeheartedly the reason that we have to have a ministry of reconciliation is because as human beings, we invariably break things. We always break things, and so we're constantly offended by things, and we have to be careful. So I began with the approach of building relationships and reaching out, to the other side politically, and I started to have breakfast and lunch and during the interim. And then we talked about what was important to us, and we talked about our mutual interest and building those relationships, getting the most powerful union in the United States are police unions. And while we didn't get many of the police law enforcement support, we were able to get some. The Texas Sheriff's Association, which I'm grateful for. Many of the unions actually worked against us and told the Republican members that this was a bad bill. And they kept going to their offices, telling them that, some were bold to say that I was a bad person. And I was grateful for the relationships because those fine Republican colleagues of mine said, you're not welcome in this office. I know Carl Sherman. He's not a bad person. And I was grateful. They actually came and told me,
wow,
shared that with me. And so we were able to get the support, understanding that our fight is not with flesh and blood. The pastors like yourself and others who were courageous to come and say this is about creating systemic accountability in law enforcement. Right. This is good for the profession of law enforcement as well as for our communities that we have. HB 929, Bo's Law, affectionately named, and 929 simply requires that police must activate their body cams and they cannot turn off their body cams during an investigation. So important. And I worked with constitutional lawyers like Lee Merritt on making sure that the provisions that were essential to the bill were maintained in the bill. And there was compromise in shaping that bill, and we got it done by the grace of God.
I think people would be interested to know, if they don't already, just how much of an institutionalist you are. That is to say, some people polarize in a way and say people who are working for social justice, for racial justice and the like, automatically are really wanting to tear down our law enforcement, our institutions. They're wanting to, when you say hold accountable, what you really mean is destroy civic responsibility and order and those sorts of things. But the truth of the matter is, you've spent your entire life as a city manager, as a mayor, part of the business community, the chambers of commerce, and other sorts of organizations that are built around keeping the social fabric intact. So you really are an anomaly in this sense that, when people come and think, here's Carl at a protest, he must be one of those guys. Well, actually, things have to be pretty bad for you to be in the streets protesting, because you're normally in the boardrooms and in the corridors of power trying to figure out how to hold things together.
Yeah, absolutely right. It is very disconcerting for me to be, outside of the boardroom. However, the Spirit of the Lord calls us to stand up for injustices. You think about the George Floyd tragedy and how that awakened the conscience of America. I believe I received so many calls from many of my friends in the pulpit, as well as the business world, that are white, and they were reaching out sincerely, wondering what could we do to affect change. And my thought on that is, America has a tendency to want to rush to reconciliation without truth. And we experience what I call compassion fatigue. So after a while, after buying all the Black Arthur books and, trying to get a better understanding, have a sense of empathy about things, we have to really understand that George Floyd was not an aberration. Before George Floyd, there was Rodney King. Before that, there was James Byrd. And before Tamir Rice was killed, the 12-year-old that was killed in his park playing by himself, an officer drives up in less than 5 seconds, kills him. In fact, 2 seconds. He pulls his revolver out and kills a 12-year-old kid who's playing by himself. Before that, there was Santos Rodriguez, 13 years old, in Dallas, Texas, pulled out of his home. His parents couldn't do anything, and put in the back of a squad car with his brother David. And the officer played Russian roulette with him. They accused him of stealing $8 out of a vending machine, which was later found to be untrue. We have to realize that in America, there are no white Santos Rodriguez's. There are no white Botham Jeans. There are no white George Floyds. There are no white Tatiana Jeffersons, no white Tamir Rice, no white Jonathan Price, no white Michael Dean. And the list goes on and on and on. And we have to do something about it. But we cannot reconcile these issues until we face the truth. And so while I love our system of governance, and it is, for me, I have a fidelity to having societal norms be the standard, that we cannot have people just act, and make their own rules and have these militias. We really have to own this. This is who we are. There's no other industrialized nation that has 1,000 people killed by police every year with firearms, 50 with stun guns every year. If they have 3 in a year in Europe, they're protesting. And here we have 3 a day. And so we have to recognize that if we are a Judeo-Christian society, we have to, realize that prayer, when people say you have our prayer and thoughts, our thoughts and prayers are with you, that's important. But before he says, the prayers of the righteous availeth much, the fervent, effectual prayers of the righteous availeth much, he says just before that, George, confess your faults one to another. So we've got to get to the truth part, and there's too much denial.
There we go. Carl, so as we think about where we are in Texas right now, getting to the truth of these things is something that it seems a lot of people are trying to avoid. The teaching of critical race theory is a red herring, it seems to me, in our public schools, because nobody's really teaching critical race theory to children. They are trying to teach a fair accounting of the racial history of our country. And, but at the same time, we have, a proliferation of guns and a kind of open season where people are unaccountable for their weapons, and now we have an abortion policy in law in Texas that allows for what amounts to the rewarding of vigilantes in our society. What in the world is happening? I mean, you are a person who believes in the system, but you were also one of those who left the chambers and went to Washington, D.C. in order not to have a quorum. And so, where are we, Carl? And what do you think is happening in our Texas culture that is preventing us from having a greater sense of unity around truthfulness that leads to reconciliation?
Yeah, well, George, I think there are three things I just like to address about that. First, the quorum break. That was something that none of us, I believe, wanted to do, but we felt that we had to do. When we looked at the issue of, many citizens losing their right to vote or the freedom to vote, it was important. When we considered the imminent concern about gerrymandering, we had to deny a quorum. The first time we denied a quorum, we went to a local church there in Austin. I led our caucus in a prayer, and we were hoping and praying that would, create the results that we wanted to have come about. Abraham Lincoln, years, century ago, did it when he was in the Illinois State House. He jumped out of his second-story window. None of us did that. We caught a plane, right? But we have precedents for this in order to, when something rises as an erosion of our democracy, we had to respond. Why is this happening right now? I believe that there are those who feel threatened by the shift in our demographics, that with 4 million new Texans in Texas over the last decade, and 95% of them being people of color, this creates some anxiety for some demographic anxiety, that shift. And some people will do anything to ensure that they maintain that control that they are accustomed to having. And so, it's human nature, I think, to try and preserve your power and look at life as though this is your fiefdom. Unfortunately, we have a history of clothing that in religion too. And, Jesus says in John 18:36 that his kingdom is not of this world, and his servants, his children, don't fight like the world fights.
Right.
But unfortunately, that's what's happening on the House floor. And that's why bills, draconian bills like HB 1927 were passed, the permitless carry bill, where all law enforcement came to the Capitol, so much so that it looked like police headquarters with all these police chiefs and rank and file that implored the legislative body to please not pass
Right.
permitless carry. They said it would make their jobs more dangerous. And despite that, the party that said they backed the blue ignored the blue
Right.
and passed the bill. And it just seems that there may be a connection, and I don't know, but the NRA, before we started our session, announced that they were moving their headquarters from New York to Texas.
Right.
And these, Scripture tells us that we should avoid the appearance of evil. So there are just some things that we have to be guarded on doing. But they passed the bill, and in our state, we have to recognize that while we have aspirational ideals about how we are all equal, we don't seem to live up to it. And it shows in our desire to erase some parts of history,
Right.
ignore some parts of history and contribution and I think eras that we've gone through, but yet highlight others. I mean, you look at the monuments and statues. I've said this before, but I think it deserves to be repeated. We have tens of thousands of monuments, of statues, of street names, of parks and schools and universities that are named after Confederate heroes who practiced genocide.
Right.
And yet, conversely, we have only 31 monuments and statues of the great emancipator, Abraham Lincoln.
Mm-hmm.
And not all of those are in the United States. Right. And our Lord's currency has his image on it. So, we fight to keep these things up because we hold them in high esteem. And yet we say one thing. Jesus says in Matthew 15:8, they draw near to me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. Our heart is on the, erection of Sam Houston and others, Lamar, and instead of recognizing that those individuals, should not be held in high esteem for what they've done.
Well, Carl, I think you and I could talk about these things all day. We've come, I think, to the end of our time together, and it's appropriate, probably, given the light coming in through the window of my room. I'm already very white, but I'm disappearing, I think, in the light here in the cloud. For those who are watching this and not just listening to it, the contrast is great, but actually, our hearts are one. And I thank you so much for being a great partner in faith and in public life, and a great advocate for justice. And we look forward to continued work together in the future.
Thank you so much, George. I appreciate you. God bless you.
Great. Take care.
Thank you. You too.